The sun had barely risen over the walls of Nineveh when the crowd gathered near the city gates. There on the packed earth, a rebel prince knelt, bound, stripped to the waist, eyes fixed on the stone steps that led up to the royal platform. Behind him stood the soldiers of Ashur-Nasir-pal II, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the pale light. The Assyrian king stepped forward, his voice carrying over the square. "Let his flesh be removed so that all may know what becomes of those who defy the Lion of Asher." 2 executioners advanced, each carrying a hooked blade. The prince's scream ripped through the still morning air as they began to cut along his back, peeling away long strips of skin while the crowd watched in silence. It was not just an act of vengeance. It was a warning carved into living flesh for every eye to see. This was the Assyrian way. They were not merely conquerors. They were engineers of terror, using cruelty as a weapon more potent than their chariots or iron swords. Across the empire, from the Zagros Mountains to the shores of the Mediterranean, stories spread of rebels who had been flayed alive, impaled on wooden stakes, or forced to march with hooks through their jaws. Whole cities surrendered without a fight, terrified by what they had heard. Assyria's rulers, Ashur-Nasir-pal, Shalmaneser, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, did not hide these horrors. They immortalized them in stone reliefs, carved on palace walls for foreign envoys to witness. Lines of prisoners with hands bound, skin hanging from hooks, heads piled in grisly heaps. Even the king's own scribes recorded the punishments in royal inscriptions, as if boasting about the empire's most sadistic achievements. For the Assyrians, fear itself was a political tool. They believed that the gods demanded order, and that rebellion was an insult to divine authority. By turning punishment into public theater, gruesome, unforgettable, and inescapable, they made sure that the very idea of defying the empire would chill the blood of every subject. And so, from the first cry of the prince beneath Nineveh's walls to the last breath of countless nameless captives, the Assyrian Empire earned its reputation as the first true masters of terror, a reputation carved not in parchment or stone alone, but in human flesh. To the Assyrians, the human body was not merely something to destroy. It was a canvas, a surface on which to etch fear. Among all the punishments they perfected, none was more infamous, more deliberately horrifying, than flaying alive. It was not done in haste. Executioners were trained for it. They used small sharp blades, more like chisels than knives, to lift the skin away without severing arteries too soon. The condemned were stripped naked and tied upright to a wooden post or the wall of a city gate. Sometimes they were kept alive for hours, even a full day, as layers of flesh were stripped from their backs, thighs, and arms. When the victim's screams grew ragged and weak, strips of flayed skin were hung on the gates, like banners of flesh fluttering in the wind, to greet anyone approaching the city. In royal inscriptions, the kings themselves bragged about this. "I flayed the chiefs and draped their skins on the city walls." Ashur-Nasir-pal II wrote of capturing rebellious leaders in the city of Suru. "I flayed the nobles who rebelled and spread their skins over the walls of the city. I impaled others on stakes, and I left them to die beneath the sun." It was not just about the individual suffering, it was about the message. Those walls of flesh told every passerby that the king's wrath was not a tale told by frightened soldiers. It was real, and it awaited anyone who thought of disobedience. The most chilling part was the public nature of it. These executions were not hidden in dark dungeons. They were staged in the heart of the city, often outside the gates where merchants, shepherds, and visiting envoys would see the punishment as they entered. The display itself became a living proclamation. This is what rebellion costs. Sometimes when an entire city rose in revolt, the punishment became collective. The men were executed or enslaved, the leaders flayed or impaled, and the women and children were marched off in chains. The skins of the dead were nailed to gates or draped over collapsed walls, turning the conquered city into a macabre warning for all who passed. Even in an age accustomed to cruelty, the Assyrians stood apart. Other empires killed. The Assyrians performed death. Their punishments were theater, bloody spectacles meant to terrify, and they succeeded. Entire regions capitulated at the mere rumor that an Assyrian army was on the march, not because of the soldiers' numbers, but because of the horrors they carried with them. For the Assyrians, fear was a currency more valuable than gold. and they spent it lavishly. It bought them obedience, tribute, and the surrender of distant kingdoms without having to fight every battle. If flaying was the Assyrians' signature, impalement was their most terrifying spectacle. The sight of it alone could break the will of whole cities. The condemned were not killed first. They were dragged before the gathered crowd, often prisoners of war, rebels, or leaders of defeated cities. Executioners forced them to the ground and pinned them down. Then came the sharpened stake, long and smooth, greased so it could pierce without splitting flesh too soon. The point was pressed against the lower abdomen, sometimes between the ribs, sometimes through the buttocks, and then driven in with slow, terrible force. With practiced precision, the stake avoided the heart and major arteries so that the victim would not die quickly. The body's own weight did the rest, sliding the victim down the pole as they writhed and screamed. Death could take hours, sometimes days, as the sun and the wind baked their exposed flesh. The Assyrians did not plant just one stake. They raised hundreds at a time outside the gates of captured cities, along roads leading into their empire, or beside the walls of a rebellious fortress. To approach an Assyrian stronghold was to walk through a forest of impaled corpses, their faces frozen in agony, their bodies twisting in the desert wind. Kings wrote of this with cold pride. Tiglath-Pileser III boasted of impaling thousands of rebels in a single campaign. Esarhaddon described leaving whole roads lined with impaled captives so that all who passed by would see and tremble. The horror lay not only in the cruelty, but in its ritual repetition. After a city fell, the streets would be silent except for the hammering of stakes into the earth, the shouts of soldiers dragging prisoners forward, and the unending screams of those raised up to die in the open air. Those who survived to see the forest of poles never forgot it. Merchants spread the stories far and wide, tales of how the Assyrians planted their enemies like trees, and those stories reached distant cities long before the Assyrian armies did. Many of those cities chose to surrender without a fight. In this way, impalement became a weapon of empire as powerful as any chariot or iron spear. It was not just punishment, it was policy, a living wall of human suffering designed to keep millions in line. The Assyrians understood something dark about human nature, that the fear of a slow public death could subdue more people than any sword. They wielded that fear with a precision that would echo across history, shaping the nightmares of conquerors for centuries to come. If impalement ruled the roads, then the pyramid of skulls ruled the city squares. The Assyrians did not simply kill their enemies, they turned their remains into monuments. When a city dared to resist and was finally taken, the Assyrian soldiers swept through the streets with calculated purpose. They dragged out the captured men, women, and even children. Some were executed on the spot, others saved for later tortures. The rest, the unlucky ones, were beheaded. Heads were brought in by the cartload to the gates of the city. There, under the eyes of the king himself, soldiers began to stack them. First a base of skulls, then another layer and another, each row packed tightly like bricks. Higher and higher they built, until a ghastly pyramid rose above the ruins, a heap of bone and clotted hair, the empty eye sockets staring down at the conquered. The stench was overpowering, but that was the point. The smell of death carried for miles, warning others of the price of defiance. Assyrian annals describe these ghastly pyramids as if they were trophies. King Ashurnasirpal II once boasted of building them so high that the topmost skulls could be seen from the city walls of neighboring towns. These pyramids were not just for show. They had a calculated psychological impact. Imagine being a farmer from a distant province, leading your donkey down the road toward the city, only to find the gates flanked by these heaps of skulls. You would know before even entering that this was a land ruled by a power that could crush entire nations. For the Assyrians, the skull pyramid was more than revenge. It was a warning carved in bone. They didn't need to keep armies in every conquered city. The sight of those pyramids, often left to bleach in the sun, did the work of 1,000 soldiers. It told every subject, rebellion means your head will join the pile. The practice spread such terror that even decades after a campaign, when the skulls had crumbled to dust, the memory of them still held towns in obedience. Mothers told their children about them in hushed voices, passing on the fear like an inheritance. In a world where kings wrote their victories in stone tablets, the Assyrians wrote theirs in flesh and bone, creating landmarks of dread that needed no words. To the Assyrians, terror was not a byproduct of war. It was the essence of rule itself. Among all the horrors of Assyrian rule, none seared itself into the memory of their enemies quite like flaying, the slow, systematic stripping of human skin. The Assyrians reserved this punishment for rebels, traitors, and enemy leaders who had dared to defy the king. Captured alive, these men were paraded before the army and the conquered city's survivors. They were often tied to a tall stake or spread-eagled against a wall. Soldiers would use sharpened bronze knives to slice through the flesh at the victim's limbs and torso. Then, working deliberately and without hurry, they peeled the skin away, often starting from the legs and moving upward, leaving raw muscle exposed to the burning sun. The process was excruciating, but the torment was far from over. Some victims were left alive, their bodies drenched in salt or oil to prolong the agony. Others were executed after being partially skinned, only to have their flayed hides displayed as a final insult. But the most terrifying part was what the Assyrians did with the skin. They didn't discard it. Instead, they nailed these gruesome trophies to the gates of the conquered city, or even draped them across the palace walls. For weeks, the sun-dried flesh of the punished would hang as a warning, its twisted features still recognizable to those who had known the victim. Kings boasted of such acts in their inscriptions. Ashurnasirpal II recorded, almost casually, "I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me, and draped their skins over the wall of the city." Imagine being a farmer summoned to deliver tribute to Nineveh, and passing through gates decorated not with banners, but with human skin. Such sights etched themselves into the minds of witnesses, ensuring that rebellion was rarely repeated. The power of flaying lay in its symbolism. Death could be swift, but to be stripped of one's very skin, the thing that made you recognizable, was to be erased as a person and reduced to an object of fear. It was as if the Assyrians declared, "We do not merely conquer your land, we peel away your humanity." In an age when most armies were content with execution, the Assyrians transformed torture into a political tool. The sight of a single flayed corpse could subdue thousands without a battle. It was cruelty elevated to strategy, a terror so profound that even centuries later, Assyrian kings were remembered as the masters of rule through fear. If flaying stripped a man of his humanity, the Assyrians had another method that turned entire battlefields into monuments of terror, the Tower of Heads. After a city was conquered, Assyrian soldiers collected the severed heads of enemy warriors and even civilians suspected of aiding the resistance. These were not dumped in piles like refuse. Instead, the heads were stacked with grim precision into massive pyramids outside city gates, along major roads, and sometimes even in front of temples. Each bloody, sun-bleached skull became a silent message. This is what happens to those who defy the king of Assyria. Archaeologists have found records describing such displays, and Assyrian reliefs carved into palace walls show them with chilling clarity. In one, soldiers calmly sort through heads as if counting grain, while scribes tally the number to ensure none were missed. For the Assyrians, terror was not random violence, and it was an organized state policy. Those not beheaded often faced impalement. The condemned were hoisted onto sharpened stakes, sometimes through the chest, sometimes through the lower body, and left to writhe for hours or days until death finally claimed them. Rows of impaled rebels lined the roads leading into Assyrian cities, turning an ordinary journey into a gauntlet of horror. Captured rulers fared no better. Defiant kings were paraded before their own defeated people before being executed in particularly degrading ways, forced to wear slave chains, sometimes mutilated, and finally slain at the feet of the Assyrian monarch. The purpose was always the same: to destroy not just the man but the image of his power. Even the aftermath of battle was turned into a weapon. Survivors were often forced to march past these towers of heads and forests of impaled bodies. Some were deliberately left alive, branded, mutilated, and released, so they could carry the tale of Assyrian cruelty back to neighboring cities. The terror was effective. In many cases, towns surrendered at the mere sight of an approaching Assyrian army, hoping to avoid the fate they had heard described by fleeing survivors. This calculated savagery helped transform Assyria from a small kingdom on the Tigris into one of the first true empires of the ancient world. Their cruelty was not mindless bloodlust. It was a form of psychological warfare, centuries before the term was even conceived. The Assyrian kings understood that terror could conquer more swiftly than swords. Conquest under the Assyrians did not always end with execution. For those who escaped the blade or the stake, there was often a slower, grinding fate, deportation and enslavement. Once a rebellious city had been subdued, its leaders executed, and its warriors slaughtered, the remaining population was not left to rebuild. Instead, Assyrian soldiers rounded up entire communities, men, women, children, even the elderly. They were bound together with heavy wooden yokes or iron collars linked by chains, sometimes with hooks piercing their noses or lips to keep them from crying out or lagging behind. The prisoners were then forced to march hundreds of miles across scorching deserts or freezing mountain passes to distant provinces of the empire. Along the way, many collapsed from exhaustion or hunger. Those who fell behind were beaten, stabbed, or simply left to die in the dust. The survivors, often no more than half of the original captives, arrived in strange lands where they were resettled as laborers or slaves. This practice of mass deportation was not merely for cheap labor. It was a deliberate tool to crush resistance. By uprooting entire communities and scattering them across far-flung regions, the Assyrians severed the bonds of kinship and culture that might spark rebellion. Inscriptions from kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II boast of moving tens or even hundreds of thousands of people in this way. The suffering did not end with the journey. In their new homes, deportees were often branded or tattooed to mark them as state property. Some were shackled to plows in the fields. Others were put to work in quarries, mines, or massive construction projects, including the grand palaces and temples of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad. Their labor literally built the empire that had destroyed their own homelands. Rebellious soldiers who survived battles were sometimes mutilated before being enslaved. Hands chopped off so they could no longer wield a sword, noses or ears sliced away as a permanent mark of shame, tendons of their legs cut so they could never run again. These crippling punishments transformed once proud warriors into broken workers. The Assyrians kept careful records of these deportations, not out of pity, but as proof of the king's might. Clay tablets and carved reliefs depict long processions of captives trudging toward an unknown fate under the watchful eyes of Assyrian soldiers. In the shadow of these policies, even distant cities often chose to submit rather than resist. They knew that fighting the Assyrians meant not just the loss of battle, but the erasure of their very way of life. This mix of swift, spectacular executions for rebels and lingering soul-crushing exile for survivors was the hallmark of Assyrian power. It ensured that their empire, brutal though it was, endured for centuries. The Assyrians did not simply conquer with armies, they conquered with terror. For nearly 3 centuries they built an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, binding diverse peoples together, not with promises of prosperity, but with the memory of what happened to those who dared to resist. The reliefs that lined the palace walls of Nineveh and Nimrud were not merely decoration. They were public warnings carved in stone, scenes of captives flayed alive, rebels impaled on stakes, and cities burning under Assyrian chariots. When foreign envoys visited the royal court, they would pass these grim murals and understand that the fate of their own nations lay in submission. The kings themselves often boasted in their inscriptions of the punishments they dealt out. Ashurnasirpal II, one of the most infamous conquerors of the early empire, wrote proudly of burning boys and girls alive and stacking heads into piles outside conquered cities. Sennacherib, whose armies besieged Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE, described in his records how he devastated enemy lands and paraded their rulers in chains. To the Assyrian monarchs, cruelty was not shameful. It was proof of divine favor and royal might. But there was a price. The very terror that kept subject peoples quiet also bred deep hatred. Neighboring kingdoms never forgot the humiliation and suffering they endured. When Assyria finally began to falter in the late 7th century BCE, weakened by civil wars and stretched too thin by constant campaigns, the oppressed nations rose in furious revenge. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others stormed Nineveh. According to later chronicles, The once mighty Assyrian capital was burned and reduced to rubble. The victors slaughtered those they found, just as Assyria had done to them for generations. The empire of the first masters of terror was wiped off the map. Yet their methods left an enduring shadow. Future empires, from the Persians to the Romans, studied the Assyrian system of mass deportation, state propaganda, and calculated brutality. The Assyrians had shown the world that fear itself could be a weapon as powerful as any sword. Today, the ruins of Assyrian cities lie silent beneath the sands of northern Iraq. But the stone carvings in museums still show the stark faces of prisoners, marched in chains, the impaled victims lined up like grim warnings from the past. They remind us of an ancient lesson, that terror can build empires, but it can also sow the seeds of their destruction.